Imagine for a moment that you are walking through Hogwarts long after curfew, when the corridors have fallen silent, and even the portraits seem to whisper more softly than usual. Good evening, my friend. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you into a mystery hidden beneath ancient stone and forgotten enchantments. Some say the castle keeps secrets even from its own teachers, waiting patiently in the dark. So settle in, listen closely, and let us follow the faintest clue into the unknown. The wind pressed softly against the tall windows of Gryffindor Tower, and the fire in the common room burned low and golden, making the shadows on the walls seem to breathe. Outside, Hogwarts lay under a cold, silver sky. The turrets stood dark against the moon, and the black lake below was smooth as glass. It was the sort of night when the castle seemed to be listening. Harry Potter sat near the fire with a book open on his knees, though he had not turned a page in nearly 10 minutes. Ron Weasley was stretched in an armchair opposite him, half asleep, and Hermione Granger was at the table, bent over a roll of parchment so fiercely that her bushy hair had fallen forward and hidden most of her face. The common room was quieter than usual. Even Fred and George, who had caused a shower of purple sparks and a brief panic involving an enchanted tea tray earlier that evening, had gone off upstairs. The younger students had drifted away one by one. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Somewhere else, a log shifted in the fire. Then the portrait hole burst open. Neville Longbottom stumbled in, pale and breathing hard, as though he had run all the way from the dungeons. "Hermione," he gasped. "Harry, Ron, there's something wrong." Ron nearly slid off his chair. "What happened?" Neville braced a hand against the mantel. "It's Eddie Kirk. He's gone." Hermione looked up at once. "Gone where?" "That's just it," said Neville. "No one knows." Harry shut his book. "Slow down. Who was with him last?" "Ginny and Luna were in the library with him after supper," Neville said. "He said he'd forgotten his charms notes in one of the empty classrooms on the 4th floor. He went to fetch them and never came back." Ron frowned. "Maybe he wandered off." Neville shook his head. "Ginny says he wouldn't just wander off, and Luna said she heard something strange." Harry stood up. "What sort of strange?" Neville lowered his voice, though there was hardly anyone left to overhear. "She said she heard a door shut where there isn't any door." For a moment, the crackle of the fire seemed very loud. Hermione rolled up her parchment at once. "Was a teacher told?" "Professor Flitwick knows," said Neville. "And Professor McGonagall. They've been searching part of the castle already, but..." He swallowed. "They told everyone to go back to their common rooms." Ron gave a weak snort. "And that's always a sign that something's fine." Harry was already reaching for his cloak. A cold feeling had crept over him, quiet and certain. Hogwarts was full of hidden places. Most of them were harmless, some were not. And when a student vanished inside the castle, it was never wise to wait and hope someone else would sort it out. Hermione rose too. "We're not supposed to leave the tower after curfew." "That's never stopped us before," Ron muttered, hauling himself up. Neville looked relieved enough to sit down on the floor. "Ginny and Luna are waiting on the landing. They thought you'd come." Harry did not answer, but a spark had already come alive in him, sharp as the moment before a Quidditch match began. Eddie Kirk was only a year below them, small and quiet, better at herbology than flying. Harry could not picture him choosing to hide as a joke. Something had happened. The four of them slipped out through the portrait hole a minute later and found Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood standing in the torchlit corridor. Ginny's arms were crossed, and she looked angry in the way she did when she was worried. Luna, dreamy as ever, wore her expression as though she had expected trouble all evening and was faintly surprised that it had taken so long to arrive. "Well?" Ginny asked the moment she saw them. "We're coming," said Harry. "Good," said Ginny, "because the teachers are searching the wrong place." Hermione stopped short. "What do you mean?" Ginny glanced down the corridor, then lowered her voice. "Eddie didn't go to the 4th floor." Neville blinked. "You said he did." "I said that's what he told us," Ginny replied, "but Luna remembered he was carrying the wrong books." Luna nodded. "He had ancient runes with him, though he doesn't take ancient runes, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if he thought someone was following him." Ron stared at her. "You noticed all that?" "I notice lots of things," said Luna. "People don't usually listen." Harry felt the cold feeling deepen. Why would he lie? "That's what we've got to find out," said Ginny. They made their way down the moving staircases with care, keeping close to the walls whenever they heard footsteps or the clink of armor. The castle at night was another world entirely. Portraits whispered in their frames. Suits of armor seemed to turn their heads a little as students passed. Drafts slid through corridors with the chill of caves, and the moonlight, falling through the high windows, made pale bars across the floor. They had reached the 2nd floor landing when Luna stopped so suddenly that Neville walked into her. "There," she said. At first, Harry saw nothing. Then he noticed it. A thin line of silver light trembling under a tapestry at the far end of the corridor. Not torchlight. Not moonlight either. It flickered like reflected water. Hermione frowned. That wasn't there before. Harry moved first. He pulled the tapestry aside, and behind it was a stretch of blank stone wall. Ron stared. "Brilliant. We've found a wall." But the silver line was still there, running in a narrow curve along the stones. Luna stepped forward and touched the wall lightly with her fingertips. "It feels cold." Harry put his hand against it. She was right. The stone was cold as winter metal, colder than the corridor air, and then, as he pressed harder, he felt the faintest tremor beneath his palm, as if something on the other side had moved. Neville made a frightened sound. "Did you feel that?" Before anyone could answer, the silver light brightened all at once. Lines raced across the wall in twisting patterns, forming the outline of a narrow door where, a heartbeat earlier, there had been none. Dust whispered down from the arch. The handle appeared last, wrought in the shape of a sleeping bird. No one spoke. Harry could hear his own breathing. Somewhere far off, a staircase groaned as it shifted. Then the corridor went still again, so still that the castle seemed to be holding its breath. "Luna," Hermione said carefully, "what exactly did you hear before Eddie disappeared?" Luna tilted her head, gazing at the new-made door. "A click," she said. Then a voice, very soft. I couldn't make out the words. Ginny drew her wand. "Well, whatever took him, I doubt it invited him in for tea." Harry gripped his own wand and reached for the handle shaped like a bird. The metal was freezing. The bird's eye opened. And from somewhere beyond the door, deep inside the hidden dark, came Eddie Kirk's voice, thin with fear, crying out for help. For a single breathless instant, none of them moved, because the sound of Eddie Kirk's frightened cry seemed to pass not only through the hidden doorway, but through the stone itself, as though the castle had taken his fear into its ancient bones and was now yielding it back in a whisper that made the corridor feel narrower and far colder than before. Harry tightened his grip on the wand in his hand, and looked from Hermione to Ron, and then to Ginny, while Neville had already gone pale enough to seem almost ghostly in the trembling silver light. And Luna, who alone did not appear startled by the door's appearance, stood gazing at the bird-shaped handle with the mild, searching expression of someone listening to a distant song. "We are not leaving him in there," said Harry, and though he spoke quietly, there was a force in his voice that brought them all forward at once. Hermione stepped beside him and stared at the handle, whose tiny metal eye remained open and watchful, glinting like a bead of moonlit ice. "This is not ordinary concealment magic," she said, and her voice had taken on that swift, precise tone it always did when fear and thought were racing side by side within her. "I have never seen a door form like this from a blank wall, and if it can answer to some spell or object, then someone either opened it deliberately or caused it to wake." Ron swallowed and looked over his shoulder into the empty corridor, as though he half expected Professor McGonagall to appear out of thin air and order them all back to Gryffindor Tower before matters became any worse. "That is a comforting thought," he muttered. "Either way, it sounds awful." Ginny raised her wand higher, and the narrow flame-like light at its tip shone across the carved edges of the door. "Open it." "Aye." Harry did, and the door swung inward without the least creak, revealing a flight of stone steps descending into darkness so complete that even the torchlight from the corridor seemed unwilling to touch it, and that darkness carried with it a breath of cold air smelling faintly of damp rock, old dust, and something stranger beneath it all, something metallic and sharp that reminded Harry of storm water on iron. The moment the doorway opened, the silver lines that had traced its shape faded from the wall behind them, leaving only the dim passage beyond and the uneasy knowledge that, once they stepped through, the way back might not remain as simple as turning around. Harry went first, because there was no chance he would allow anyone else to walk into danger ahead of him when Eddie's voice had called from below. And because there was also no use pretending that caution would keep them safe if whatever lay beneath Hogwarts had already taken one student and might be reaching for others. Hermione came directly behind him, then Ron and Ginny, while Luna moved with her curious, unhurried lightness, and Neville brought up the rear, casting anxious looks behind them until the door at last drifted shut of its own accord and sealed them into a silence so heavy that Neville gave a little gasp before mastering himself. The staircase did not descend in a straight line, but curved slowly inward like the inside of a tower turned upside down, and their footsteps echoed below them in soft, uneven beats that seemed to return from far greater depth than the stairs alone could account for. Harry kept his wand raised, and the pale gold light at its tip showed walls covered in carvings, worn nearly smooth by time, though here and there he could still make out shapes that seemed to be birds with folded wings, tall, narrow arches, and circles within circles that might once have formed a pattern but now looked only like fragments of a forgotten design. "Hogwarts has secret passages," Ron whispered, and the whisper came back to them from below in a faint murmur. "But since when does it have this sort of place?" "Since long before us," Hermione replied, and even in the dimness Harry could hear her mind working furiously. "These stones are older than most of the castle above, or they have been preserved by powerful enchantment, and either way I do not think students were ever meant to come here." Luna ran her fingers lightly across the wall as she walked. "It feels asleep," she said, and when no one answered, she added in that same calm voice, "but not peacefully." After another turn of the stair, they came to a narrow landing where the passage opened into a circular chamber no larger than a classroom store cupboard, though far stranger than any cupboard Hogwarts had ever held. For in the center stood a basin of black stone, filled not with water, but with a silver mist that moved in slow curling folds, while all around the chamber's edge small doors, each no more than shoulder width, had been set into the walls and marked with symbols that shone faintly whenever the mist stirred. Harry had barely taken in the sight when the mist in the basin shivered, rose, and gathered itself into a wavering image of Eddie Kirk, who appeared for one terrible instant to be running down a corridor while looking over his shoulder in panic. Before the image broke apart and the mist dropped again into silence, Neville made a strangled noise. That was him. That was definitely him. Hermione was already kneeling beside the basin, though she kept her face at a careful distance from the mist. This is some sort of tracking enchantment or memory projection, but I cannot yet tell whether it is showing where he is now or where he was when he passed through. Ginny had moved to the nearest of the little doors and was examining the symbol cut into it, which looked like a crescent crossed by 3 lines. There are 6 exits. Splendid, said Ron, because one cursed hidden staircase was not enough. Harry stared into the mist again, forcing himself to think. The chamber felt wrong, not because it was dark or ancient, but because it had the ordered, waiting quality of a place built for purpose, and that purpose had not ended. Someone had made this room to guide, divide, or test those who entered it, and the memory of that intention still clung to the stones like a spell that had never quite finished being cast. Then Luna bent toward the basin and said, almost dreamily, "It is not showing where Eddie went." Harry turned to her. "How do you know?" "Because," she said, pointing into the silver haze, "that is not Eddie running away from something." Whoa! As they all looked, the mist rose once more, and this time Harry saw what Luna had seen at once, though a chill passed through him when he understood it, for the figure in the silver basin was indeed Eddie, but his face, turned half over his shoulder in fear, wasn't fixed upon something behind him at all. It was fixed upon something ahead. And just as that realization struck them, one of the 6 narrow doors around the chamber began, very slowly, to open. The narrow door did not fly wide with any dramatic violence, but moved inward by inches so slow and deliberate that the sight of it was all the more dreadful, for it gave the impression not of a trap springing, but of a watchful will inviting them onward with ancient patience, as though it had known from the moment they crossed the threshold that sooner or later they would have no choice but to follow where it led. No one spoke at first, because the silver mist in the basin still trembled with the fading image of Eddie's frightened face, and the half-open door seemed to breathe out a darkness deeper than the chamber itself, a darkness in which Harry thought he caught, not a shape exactly, but the suggestion of movement far beyond the reach of wandlight. Ron was the first to break the silence, though his voice came out lower than usual and without the trace of complaint he often used to cover unease. "I do not like that door at all. And I realize that saying so is about as useful as announcing that water is wet, but I felt it ought to be said." Hermione rose from beside the basin and brushed stone dust from her knees, her eyes fixed not on the doorway, but on the symbol carved beside it, which was unlike the others in one important respect, for while the remaining doors bore marks that glimmered faintly and steadily, this one had begun to pulse with a soft silver light, as if the chamber itself were selecting a single path from many. "It wants us to take this route," she said. "Whether that is because it leads to Eddie, or because it leads to whatever took him, I cannot yet tell, but standing here will not help him." Neville made an effort to steady his breathing, though his hand shook around his wand. Could it be a trick, then, showing us that image so we follow the wrong way? "It could," Hermione answered, with the honesty that made her reliable even when the truth was unwelcome. Yet if this room is meant to divide or guide those who enter, then every path may be dangerous. The important thing is to understand what the magic is doing before it has the chance to get ahead of us. Luna was still looking into the basin, where the mist had settled into a smooth, silver surface like moonlit glass. "It is not trying to frighten us away," she said, and there was something so certain in her tone that even Ron turned to her. If it wished that, it would have shown something worse. It wants us to see what Eddie saw, but not why. Harry felt the truth of that at once, because the image had indeed been strange in exactly that way, withholding the thing that mattered most. Eddie had been fleeing, but from what, or toward what, the chamber had not revealed. It was like receiving half a warning and half an invitation together, and the uncertainty of it pressed at Harry with a familiar weight, the same hard pressure he had known in the years when danger at Hogwarts never arrived cleanly from one direction, but wrapped itself in riddles, false turns, and secrets concealed inside older secrets. Ginny stepped to the half-open door and peered through the gap with wand raised, though the light seemed to vanish a few feet in, swallowed by a passage that curved sharply left. "There is writing on the inside wall," she said. Hermione was beside her in an instant, and Harry followed close enough to see that a line of lettering had been cut into the stone at eye level in a script so narrow and elegant that it might have been decorative until one noticed the precision of every stroke. Hermione traced the air above it without touching. "It is not Latin," she murmured, "nor runes exactly. It resembles some of the Founder period inscriptions mentioned in Hogwarts, a history, though those were fragmentary and often damaged." Ron gave her a bleak look. Comforting again. Harry stared at the inscription, and though he could not read it, one symbol near the end stirred an uneasy memory. It resembled a bird with folded wings, much like the handle on the hidden door above, except that beneath it had been carved 3 small stars and a single descending line. Then Luna, to everyone's astonishment, except perhaps her own, said softly, "It means the path remembers the one who enters." Hermione turned so quickly that her hair brushed the wall. "How do you know that?" Luna tilted her head, as if considering how best to explain something obvious. "I do not know it exactly. It is only what the shape suggests. Some writing tells you its meaning even when you do not know the language, particularly when it has been used for a very long time by people who expected magic to do part of the speaking." Hermione opened her mouth as though to object, then closed it again, because in a place like this, beneath a school built upon centuries of spell work and secrecy, Luna's explanation was no stranger than the chamber itself. Harry looked once more at the open door and made the decision before fear had time to crowd in around it. "We go together, we do not split up, and if this passage changes, we mark every turn." He drew his wand across the stone beside the doorway and said, "Flagrate," leaving a glowing red X that burned upon the wall like a coal mark. Ginny immediately added a second sign below it, a bright curling G, while Hermione conjured a thread of blue light to coil around the doorframe like a ribbon. Ron, catching on, etched a crooked R that leaned alarmingly to one side. "It is artistic," he said defensively when Ginny gave it a look. Neville swallowed and nodded. "Right. Together." They stepped through. The passage beyond was narrower than Harry had expected, so narrow in places that Ron's shoulder brushed the stone, and the air within it was colder by several degrees, carrying that same metallic scent more strongly now, though mingled with a trace of something burnt, as though a spell had gone wrong there long ago and left its ghost behind. The floor sloped gently downward, and after only a short distance the chamber vanished behind a bend, leaving them enclosed by bare walls that seemed almost to absorb sound, so that even their breathing came back to them only faintly. At first there was nothing but the quiet passage and the steady movement of wand light over stone. Yet the farther they went, the more Harry became aware of details that made the place more unnerving than open danger would have done, because every 20 paces or so, another inscription appeared, cut into the walls in the same fine script, and between the words there recurred that sign of the folded bird, sometimes alone and sometimes enclosed within a circle. Beneath one carving lay a line of scratches as if someone had dragged metal across the wall in desperation, while farther on they passed a recessed niche holding the broken remains of what might once have been a lantern, though no rust marked it, and the shards looked as if they had only just been shattered. "This passage is being used," Hermione whispered, kneeling briefly to inspect the dust near the wall. "Look at these marks. Something moved through here recently, and not only Eddie. There are several sets of footprints, though the older ones are oddly blurred, as if the floor did not wish to keep them." Ron looked distinctly unhappy at the notion of a floor with preferences, but before he could answer, Ginny stopped so abruptly that Harry nearly collided with her. At the end of the next turn, the passage opened into a low rectangular hall, and across its floor, from wall to wall, stretched a sheet of pale light like frozen water, perfectly still and shining from within. On the far side stood another archway leading onward into dark, and beside that archway, half turned as though he had been running when something caught him, was Eddie Kirk. He was there, and not there. His figure shone faintly silver, not with the shifting softness of a ghost, but with the sharp stillness of an image pinned in place, his face frozen in alarm, one hand flung out toward the archway as though he had almost reached safety. Neville let out a hoarse breath. Is that really him? Harry took one careful step forward, and at once the sheet of pale light across the floor rippled. Then Eddie's silver image opened its mouth and, in a voice far louder than before and full of raw terror, cried, "Do not cross." The rest of the warning never came, because the shining floor split down the middle with a flash like lightning under ice, and something vast moved beneath it. The warning shattered with the light, and in the same instant the floor before them became transparent as glass, so that Harry saw not stone beneath the shining surface, but a depth impossible within the walls of any ordinary corridor, a black gulf crossed by slow-turning currents of silver radiance in which enormous shadows moved with the heavy silence of creatures too large to belong in any place made by human hands. Harry threw out an arm to stop Ron and Neville, while Hermione seized Ginny's sleeve before she could spring forward in the fierce, reckless way that had already gathered in her stance, and all 6 of them stood at the edge of that living brightness with their wands up and their breath held, because it was plain at once that the pale sheet across the floor had not been laid there as a bridge, but as a veil concealing something ancient and dangerous that did not sleep as deeply as the builders of this hidden way had once intended. Beneath the trembling surface, one of the shadows rose, and as it passed through the silver currents, Harry glimpsed the outline of a vast wing folded close against a lean, serpent-like body, though it vanished so swiftly that he could not be certain whether he had truly seen it, or whether the magic below was shaped to frighten intruders with forms drawn from their own fears. Hermione's voice came low and taut beside him. "It is an enchantment of depth and memory together, and I think the warning was genuine, because whatever is under there is bound to the crossing, and the crossing reacts to movement." Ron swallowed with an effort that seemed almost audible. "You say that as if it helps, Hermione, but all it really tells me is that beneath us there is either a monster or a magical illusion designed by someone with a truly nasty imagination." Luna, who had moved nearer the edge than Harry would have liked, peered downward with grave interest, and the pale light reflected in her wide eyes, so that for a moment she looked strangely like one of the old portraits in the castle, all stillness and silver. "It is not a monster in the ordinary sense," she said softly. "It is more like a guardian that has forgotten what it was meant to guard, and now only remembers that crossing must not be easy." Neville gave a small, despairing laugh that held no humor at all. "That is somehow worse." On the far side of the shimmering gulf, Eddie's silver image remained frozen in its unfinished attempt to flee. Yet now that Harry looked more closely, he saw that the boy's outline flickered at the edges, as though it had not been placed there to deceive, but was a trace left by the moment itself, a warning stamped into the magic by fear. Eddie had truly been there. He had truly tried to cross, and something in this hall had answered him. Ginny narrowed her eyes at the motionless figure. If the path remembers the one who enters, then this is not a ghost and not a trick. It is the passage holding on to what happened. Hermione nodded, her mind already racing ahead. Yes, and if it preserved the warning, then it may also preserve the means of getting across. Ancient protective systems often work that way, especially when they are built to test rather than simply kill. The danger is real, but there should be a rule governing it. Ron looked at the floor with deep suspicion. "I hate magical rules. They always make sense just after someone nearly dies." Harry crouched near the edge without touching it and studied the surface. The silver light did not flow evenly, but gathered in narrow bands that crossed and recrossed like the threads of a web. Between those bands, faint marks were visible beneath the shine. Not cracks exactly, but lines of darker stone hidden within the brightness. He shifted slightly, and one of the lines glimmered for an instant, as though his movement had woken it. "There is a pattern," he said. Hermione dropped to one knee beside him at once. "Where?" He pointed, and together they followed the faint webbing beneath the surface from one side of the hall toward the other, until at last the shape emerged. Not a random network, but the outline of a path made of narrow stepping stones concealed beneath the magical veil, twisting between the silver currents in a course so irregular that no one could have crossed it at a run. "It is hidden," Hermione whispered, "so that only someone who stops and sees it may pass." "Which Eddie did not have time to do," said Ginny, and her anger had deepened now, because fear in Ginny rarely remained fear for long, but hardened swiftly into resolve. Something was chasing him. Harry looked at the trapped image again. Or he thought something was. The distinction mattered, though he could not yet say why. Luna lifted her wand and let its light fall across the nearest stretch of the shining floor, and where the beam touched, one of the concealed stones showed more clearly than the rest, pale and square beneath the light like a shape seen under ice. "The way across dislikes haste," she murmured. "That seems rather like old magic." Ron stared at her. "You say things that sound mad until 5 minutes later when they turn out to be completely right, and I would like it noted that this is unsettling." Neville, still pale, squared his shoulders. "Then we go carefully." Harry straightened, though his gaze kept returning to the vast dark beneath the floor, where the silver currents swirled now with greater speed, as if aware that they had understood part of the riddle. "No," he said. "I go first. If the crossing reacts to movement, one person is safer than 6 all at once." Ginny opened her mouth to object, and he met her eyes before she could speak. "If I get across, I can help the rest of you follow the same path." Hermione hesitated only a moment before nodding, because logic, once it had shown itself to her, was never easy to deny. Watch the stones for any change in color or light, and do not trust the gaps between them even if they look solid. That is another sentence I never wanted to hear, Ron muttered. Harry took a slow breath, then stepped forward and placed one foot upon the first hidden stone. At once the entire hall gave a low, resonant hum, deep as the note of a struck bell sounding far underground, while beneath the shining veil, the shadow he had seen before wheeled upward in a great silent arc and vanished beneath his feet. He did not look down again. The first stone held. He moved to the second, then to the third, following the concealed path as Hermione called out the next turn, and Luna, with uncanny certainty, warned him when a stone that had seemed stable was beginning to dim. Twice the silver currents surged upward around his ankles like cold fire, and once the whole hall darkened so sharply that for one sickening instant he thought the path had disappeared. But then the hidden stones brightened again, as though recognizing that he had not broken the rule of the crossing. He was halfway across when the frozen image of Eddie flickered violently. Harry stopped dead. The silver figure turned its head. Not slowly, not like a memory replaying itself, but with sudden life. And in a voice that was no echo at all, Eddie Kirk cried from the far side of the hall, "Harry, get back! It knows your name!" Harry's foot hovered above the next hidden stone, and in that suspended instant the whole hall seemed to tighten around him like a drawn wire, because Eddie's voice had not come with the hollow distance of the preserved warning, but with the raw, immediate strain of someone who was alive, frightened, and far closer than the magic of the passage had any right to allow. Then the silver currents below the floor surged upward in twisting ribbons, and the vast shape beneath them struck the underside of the shining veil with such force that the entire crossing rang like glass under a hammer, though it did not break, and Harry nearly lost his balance as the narrow stone beneath his foot lurched sideways by the width of a finger. "Do not move!" Hermione cried, and her voice, though sharp with alarm, held the hard steadiness of a command flung across panic before it could spread. Harry froze at once, every muscle locked, while the pale floor around him brightened to a blinding white, and the darkness below deepened until it seemed to draw in the wand light itself. From the far side of the hall, Eddie's figure flickered again, no longer flat and silver as before, but layered strangely with shadow, as if the image the passage had preserved was being pushed aside by the presence of the real boy somewhere beyond it. "It knows your name," Eddie said again, more faintly now, and there was something desperate in the way the words seemed to drag against the stone. "It called you." Ron made a noise that was half disbelief and half outrage. "That is not a thing enchanted hallways ought to be doing." Hermione's eyes never left the crossing. "Names matter in old magic," she said, speaking quickly now because thought and danger had begun to race together. Particularly full names, spoken by the magic itself or offered to it by someone crossing a bound place. "Harry, did you say your name aloud when you entered?" "No," Harry answered, though he scarcely trusted his breath enough to speak at all. Ginny looked towards the far side, where the wavering image of Eddie stood at the archway like a trapped reflection. Then something else did. At that, a whisper moved through the hall, so low at first that it might have been only the hum of the floor, yet it gathered shape with unnerving clarity, sliding over the stone from no single direction and every direction at once. "Harry James Potter." The words were not loud, but the effect of hearing them there, in that hidden chamber beneath Hogwarts, spoken by a voice neither human nor wholly bodiless, sent a cold shock through Harry so fierce that for a moment he forgot the danger under his feet and thought only of all the times his name had drawn trouble to him. From the goblet of fire to the prophecy he had never asked to bear. Yet this felt different. This was older. The voice did not speak his name in anger or triumph, but with the grave certainty of a lock recognizing a key. Luna stepped forward until Ginny's hand caught her sleeve. "It remembers stories," she said quietly. "Not only footsteps." Hermione turned to her with sudden understanding. "The path remembers the one who enters, not merely where they walked, but who they are." Ron stared at the glowing floor as if personally betrayed by it. "So this awful place sorts people?" "In a manner of speaking," Hermione replied, "or weighs them against records it already holds." Harry kept his eyes on the next hidden stone, though every instinct urged him either to leap forward or retreat at once. Neither would do. The whole crossing was built to punish haste. That much they knew. He drew a careful breath and called, "Eddie, where are you?" The answer came after a heartbeat's delay, as though it had to travel through water or dream. "Past the archway. There is a room, and I cannot get out. I thought I saw a way back, but every corridor led me in circles, and then that thing under the floor woke when I tried to cross." "Did you open this place?" Hermione shouted. "No," Eddie cried. "I was following someone." All 6 of them reacted to that at once. "Who?" Ginny demanded. But before he could answer, the silver figure at the archway bent sharply sideways, as though seized by an unseen force, and the image tore across its middle in a jagged line of light. Eddie's next words came broken and blurred. "I thought it was Cho. No, it only looked." The rest vanished in a hiss of static magic, and at once the whispering voice in the hall returned. "Not the right story." The words passed beneath Harry's feet like a shudder in the stone, and one of the hidden stepping stones behind him went dark. Neville gave a small cry. "It is changing the path." "Of course it is," said Ron, with the kind of dreadful calm people sometimes reached when matters had become too alarming to improve by panicking. That would be exactly the sort of thing it would do. Hermione's face had gone very pale, though her voice remained controlled. "Listen to me, all of you. This place is not merely testing movement. It is testing truth, memory, perhaps even intent." Eddie followed something disguised as someone he trusted, and the passage reacted to a false story or a false identity. "That means appearances here cannot be relied upon." Ginny's gaze sharpened. "Polyjuice?" "No," Hermione said at once. "Not unless someone brewed it in secret and used it extraordinarily well, and even then I do not think ordinary deception would wake a passage like this. It feels more like projection magic, something drawn from expectation. A person sees whom they are prepared to see." Luna nodded, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. "Like a dream, choosing the shape that will make you follow it." Harry looked toward the archway, and for one unsettling instant the wavering light there gathered itself into the outline of Sirius, standing in shadow with one hand raised, not in warning, but in summons. The sight struck him so sharply that his whole body leaned forward before reason caught hold. Then the shape broke apart. Harry shut his eyes for a single second and opened them again, furious now rather than shaken, because the trick had shown its hand at last. "It is trying to pull us where we most want to go." Hermione seized on that immediately. "Then resist every first instinct. Trust only what we can confirm." Whoa! Below the veil, the vast shadow wheeled once more, and Harry saw more of it now through the streaming silver currents. A long, narrow head, no eyes that he could make out, and wings that seemed made not of feathers but of articulated plates of darkness, like a creature assembled from old armor and storm cloud together. It did not seem wholly alive in the ordinary sense. Rather, it moved with the terrible, exact obedience of something bound to a task long after time should have worn it away. "The Guardian," Luna said softly. "It is waiting for the true crossing." Ron blinked. "I hesitate to ask, but what do you mean by true?" Instead of answering, Luna pointed to the stones ahead of Harry's feet. A new line had begun to appear in the shining floor, bright as moonlit ink, running not toward the archway where Eddie's image flickered, but slantwise toward the left-hand wall, where there was nothing at all but carved stone. Hermione saw it too and drew in a breath. "The visible goal is false. The archway is bait." "That is very annoying," said Ron. "But useful," Ginny replied. "If the crossing changes for truth, then the real path has just shown itself." Harry lowered his wandlight toward the new line. Sure enough, faint hidden stones were emerging one by one in the direction Luna had indicated, while those that led straight toward the archway began to dim and dissolve into the white glow. The hall was rewriting itself in answer to what they had learned. He shifted his weight carefully and turned left upon the narrow stone beneath him. The instant he did, the whispering voice fell silent. Then, on the far side, the archway where Eddie's image had stood vanished like mist, revealing only blank wall. And from somewhere behind that wall, muffled but unmistakable, Eddie Kirk pounded with both fists and shouted, "Hurry! It has gone to fetch the others!" The blows from behind the blank wall came again, hollow yet urgent, and they carried through the hall with a dreadful clarity that made the false archway's disappearance seem all the more sinister, because it proved that the passage had not merely misled them with illusions, but had hidden the true shape of the place behind a veil of crafted expectation, showing each intruder the door they were most likely to trust, while sealing the real one behind silence and stone. Harry did not hesitate now, because the shifting line of pale stones had become the only honest thing in the chamber, and honesty, in a place where every image seemed eager to betray them, had the force of a command. He moved left, placing each foot with rigid care upon the newly revealed path, while the silver currents below churned in growing agitation, and the shadowed guardian beneath the floor turned in a wide, slow circle, as though following the course of his thoughts, rather than the sound of his steps. Behind him, Hermione called directions in a voice taut with concentration, for the stones ahead did not remain visible for long, but glimmered into sight only moments before they were needed, while Luna, with that strange, dream-like certainty that had already guided them more than once, kept saying, "Not that one," or "Wait," at just the instant when Harry's eye had fixed on a square of light that would have led him wrong. Ron, Ginny, Neville, and Hermione had spread along the edge of the hall, careful not to touch the shining floor, and the reflected light threw wavering brightness across their faces, so that they seemed for a moment like watchers gathered at the edge of a moonlit lake. Harry reached the far wall at last, though not at the place where the false archway had stood, but several yards to its left, where the stones looked entirely solid and unremarkable until one noticed, as Hermione did first, the thin seam running in a tall curve from floor to shoulder height, and the bird symbol carved at the top, worn so faint with age that it might have been mistaken for a flaw in the rock. "It is here," Harry said, pressing his hand against the seam. At once the stone gave a shiver beneath his palm, and from behind it Eddie cried out, not with fear this time, but with desperate relief. Harry, do not use a spell on it. It wakes when magic strikes the wall. That sounds like exactly the sort of thing that would happen, Ron called across the hall, while Ginny was already scanning the stones on Harry's route, as though memorizing them for the crossing of the rest. Hermione, however, was staring not at the hidden door, but at the carvings running beside it, and Harry could hear the fierce speed of her breathing as her mind worked over them. The wall is not locked in the ordinary sense, she said. It is listening for the right phrase, or perhaps the right answer, and if the passage remembers stories, then the door may open only to a true account of why we have come. Ron gave a disbelieving laugh. Brilliant, a talking wall that marks essays. It is better than blasting it, said Hermione sharply, though there was the faintest flicker of humor in her voice despite everything, and then she stepped to the edge of the crossing and called, Eddie, tell us exactly what happened from the beginning, and do not leave anything out just because it seems small. There was a pause on the other side of the wall, filled only by the hum of the silver veil and the slow movement of the guardian beneath it. And when Eddie answered, his voice had steadied a little, as though being asked for facts instead of fear had given him something firm to hold. I went to the library after supper, he said, speaking quickly now. Ginny and Luna were there, and I told them I had left my charms notes upstairs, but that was not true, because this afternoon I found a bit of parchment tucked into my bag, and on it was written that if I wanted to see a room no one else in Hogwarts knew about, I should come to the second-floor corridor after dark and bring no teacher. Harry glanced back towards the others, and even at that distance, he saw Hermione close her eyes for one brief, exasperated instant, because no sentence beginning with, "If you want to see a secret room," had ever led to anything sensible inside Hogwarts. I thought it was a joke, Eddie went on, but the writing at the bottom said it was from Cho Chang, and I believed it, because I have seen her in the owlery, and once in the entrance hall, and I thought perhaps she wanted… Well, that does not matter, but I thought perhaps she meant to be kind. It matters enough, Ginny muttered darkly, though whether she was angry at the trick, or at the idea of anyone using Cho's face to bait a younger boy, Harry could not tell. So I went, said Eddie, and there was someone there. Only I could not see them properly because they stood half in shadow behind the tapestry, and when they turned it was Cho's face, but wrong somehow, as if I recognized it before I truly saw it. She said I must be quick, and that the room would open only for a minute, and when the door appeared I followed her down the stairs. At first she was ahead of me, but on the stairs I heard another set of footsteps behind us, and when I looked back no one was there. Then when I turned again, Cho had gone. Luna's expression did not change, but she said very softly, "The passage took over." Eddie continued, his voice tightening. I came into the round chamber with the silver basin, and one of the doors was already open. I thought that meant I should go through it, and beyond was a corridor full of whispering. I kept hearing people I knew calling my name, only never from the same direction twice, and sometimes it was my mum, and once it was Professor Sprout, and once it was me. Then I reached this hall and saw the archway, and thought I heard someone running on the other side, so I ran too. The floor woke, and that thing underneath came up, and I only got away because the wall opened when I shouted that I had been fooled. Hermione straightened so suddenly that Harry knew she had seized the answer. That is it, she said. Not a password, but a truth. The door opens to confession of false guidance. This passage was built to punish those who follow borrowed faces and to spare those who admit they were deceived. Ron stared. There are times, Hermione, when the way your mind works is honestly a bit frightening. Thank you, she said absently, and then called across to Harry. Tell the door the truth plainly, and be specific. These old enchantments dislike vagueness. Harry turned back to the seam in the wall, placed both hands against the cold stone, and said with all the steadiness he could gather, "We came because Eddie Kirk was lured here by false appearance, and we have followed through illusion not for secrets or power, but to bring him back safely." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the bird carving overhead brightened. A soft tremor ran through the wall, the seam widened, and a narrow doorway opened inward just enough to show Eddie standing in a dim chamber beyond, pale, dusty, and wide-eyed, but otherwise unharmed. "Harry," he said with such relief that it almost sounded like disbelief. Harry took an involuntary step forward, and at once the guardian beneath the shining floor rose with terrifying speed, striking upward so hard that the veil flashed white, and every visible stone vanished. "Do not move!" Hermione shouted, but the warning came a fraction too late, because the stone under Harry's leading foot dissolved into light, and he dropped waist-deep through the crossing as freezing silver fire surged around him, while below, out of the black depth, the guardian unfurled its wings and opened a mouth full of darkness. Then Ginny moved. She did not scream, nor stop to think, but launched herself out onto the path Harry had taken, following it with a speed that should have been impossible, and was perhaps madness, except that every step fell exactly where it must, as though she had fixed the route in her mind with such perfect fury that fear itself had no room to enter. "Hermione," Ron bellowed, already reaching for her shoulder. "Do something." Hermione's wand was in her hand before the words had ended. "Not a summoning charm," she snapped, more to herself than to them. "Not direct force. It will treat that as attack." Luna, staring into the blazing floor, said in a voice of sudden, eerie clarity, "The Guardian is not trying to eat him. It is trying to keep the story unfinished." And with Harry suspended above the dark, Ginny flinging herself toward him, Eddie stretching both hands through the half-open doorway, and the silver currents rising like a storm beneath them, the meaning of those words began to dawn on Hermione's face. Hermione's expression changed with startling swiftness, for the alarm that had flared there gave way all at once to recognition. And Harry, though half swallowed by the blazing crossing and fighting the icy pull of the silver force around his legs, saw that look and knew she had understood something vital, something hidden not in the danger itself, but in the purpose beneath it, which in places of old magic was often the only difference between a trial that could be survived and a trap that could not. "It is bound to sequence," she cried, her voice ringing across the hall with a force that held even Ron motionless at the edge of the veil. "This whole passage is made to resist interruption, false identities, and unfinished intent. Harry, do not struggle against it as if it were dragging you down, because that will only confirm the breach. You must complete the action you began." Ron stared at her in disbelief, sharp enough to cut stone. "He is halfway through the floor, Hermione. You may have noticed." "Yes, and the floor reacted the moment he turned rescue into flight," she answered. And if her tone was fierce, it was because terror had been hammered into thought so hard that only certainty was left. The door opened to the truth of why we came. The crossing accepted him until he stepped back from that truth. It is not punishing movement. It is punishing broken purpose. The words struck Harry through the panic like cold water through flame, because in the instant Eddie had appeared, he had indeed done the one thing the passage could not permit. He had moved toward the rescue and then recoiled from the danger, splitting one act into two. This was not a corridor that tolerated hesitation once intent had been declared. It was a place made by minds that believed one either crossed or did not cross. One either came to save or had never truly come at all. Ginny was still racing toward him, her red hair streaming behind her in the white glare. But Harry shouted at once, because he understood now that if she seized him by sheer force, She might break the same rule and be taken in turn. "Do not pull me back." She did not slow, though anger flashed across her face so brightly that it seemed almost another light in the hall. "I was not planning to." Below him, the Guardian had fully risen now, its wings unfurling through the black depth, with a vast, deliberate grace that was worse than any lunge might have been, because it did not look ravenous or enraged, but exact, like a judge waking to enforce a law inscribed long before any of them were born. Its head, narrow and armor dark, lifted until Harry could feel the force of its attention like pressure against his chest. And though he saw no eyes, he knew with dreadful certainty that it was not merely aware of him, but measuring him against something ancient and inflexible. Eddie had thrust himself as far as he could through the half-open doorway in the wall, one hand braced against the stone and the other outstretched. "You must come through," he shouted, voice cracking with urgency. "That is what it wants finished." Luna, still at the hall's edge beside Hermione and Ron, spoke into the chaos as though she were naming stars. "The Guardian keeps the crossing true. It does not want Harry beneath the floor. It wants him on the right side of the choice." Neville, pale but steadying, seized upon that with the desperate courage of someone who has no room left for doubt. Then help him get forward, not back. Ginny reached Harry at last, balanced on a narrow stone that glimmered only faintly under her shoes, and crouched low with one hand extended, not toward his arm, but toward his wand. "Give me your left hand only if you are using the right to move ahead," she said, and even now there was no tremor in her voice, only fierce command sharpened by fear. "I will not drag you backward, but I can stop you twisting off the path." Harry shifted carefully, every muscle straining against the freezing pressure around his legs, which had begun to feel less like liquid fire now, and more like bands of cold metal tightening and loosening by turns, testing his balance, his resolve, perhaps even his honesty. He forced himself not to wrench away from it. Instead, he thrust his wand arm toward the open doorway where Eddie stood, and with his free hand, he caught Ginny's wrist. The instant he did, the silver force around his legs changed. It did not vanish, nor release him, but tilted, as though some immense weight beneath the crossing had altered direction. The Guardian's wings flared wide, sending currents of white fire racing across the veil, and then the pressure that had been dragging Harry down became a terrible sideways pull, hauling him not into the gulf, but toward the hidden door. "Now," Hermione cried. Eddie lunged. Ginny braced both feet, every line of her body drawn taut, and Harry threw himself with all the force he had left toward the opening in the wall, while behind him the crossing gave a sound like ice splitting at the end of winter, and the Guardian surged upward in one final arc. For a heartbeat, Harry thought he would fail, because the silver force clamped around one ankle and held fast with a grip stronger than chains. But then Eddie caught his sleeve. Ginny heaved with a strength born of fury and terror together, and Harry slammed hard against the edge of the hidden doorway, scraping shoulder and hip on the stone as he was dragged through. The moment his body crossed the threshold, the hall erupted. The shining floor dropped into darkness, the visible stones vanished, and the Guardian struck the underside of the veil with such force that the whole chamber boomed like a bell tower in storm, while the hidden door tried at once to close. Harry rolled inward, pulling Ginny's arm after him by sheer instinct, and she came through half a second before the stone slammed shut behind them with a violence that shook dust from the ceiling. For several breaths, no one spoke. Harry lay sprawled upon cold flags, lungs burning, while Eddie crouched beside him, and Ginny, on her knees and furious beyond words, was still gripping Harry's sleeve as if she had no intention of releasing it until sunrise. From the other side of the wall they could hear muffled shouts, and then Hermione's voice, sharp but controlled, calling that they were still there and would find another way around. Harry pushed himself upright, wincing as the bruised side of his body protested, and looked at Eddie properly for the first time. The younger boy was dusty and shaken, his hair in disarray and his tie half undone. But he was whole, and the sight of that alone drove back some portion of the cold that had settled into Harry's bones. "You all right?" Harry asked. Eddie laughed once in a breathless, disbelieving way. "I think so. You are the one who fell into a magical abyss." Ginny rose at once and turned in a full circle, wand up, because whatever chamber they had entered was no place for resting simply because it had walls. It was long and narrow, with a low arched ceiling and shelves cut directly into the stone, many of them empty, while others held fragments of things so old and strange that Harry could not name them at a glance. A cracked brass astrolabe, a bird skull plated in silver, bundles of parchments bound in green-black cord, and small sealed boxes on which symbols had been burned rather than carved. At the far end of the room stood another door, not hidden this time, but tall and black, banded with dull metal and marked at its center with the same folded bird emblem that had followed them through the passage like a repeated warning. "It is a storeroom," Hermione's muffled voice came through the wall, thinner now but still audible. "Or an antechamber. Is there another exit?" Harry went to the black door and pressed his ear against it. Beyond lay only a depth of silence that seemed too complete to trust. "Yes," he called back, "but it looks worse." "That is about what I expected," Ron's voice answered faintly, and even through stone his resentment seemed perfectly clear. Eddie rose slowly, rubbing one wrist. "I have seen that door before," he said, and at once Harry and Ginny turned to him. "When the wall first opened for me, I thought I had escaped, but I only reached this room. I tried that door, and it would not move. Then I heard footsteps outside again, though not from the hall. They were somewhere beyond it." Harry felt the tension return at once, because danger beneath Hogwarts never came alone for long. "What sort of footsteps?" Eddie swallowed. "More than one pair, and none of them hurried, as if they already knew where I was." Ginny stepped closer to the black door, wand light glancing off the dull bands of metal, and in the stillness that followed, they all heard it. Not beyond the wall through which Harry had come, where Hermione and the others were searching for another route, but beyond the black door ahead. Footsteps. Several of them. Slow, measured, and drawing nearer. The sound of those approaching footsteps carried through the heavy black door with a dreadful clarity that allowed no room for doubt, for each measured step rang faintly against stone beyond, as though the corridor on the other side were long and narrow, and the steady rhythm of more than one walker suggested not aimless wandering, but purpose, direction, and an unhurried certainty that the destination lay exactly where it ought to be. Ginny did not step back, though every instinct would have urged retreat from such a sound in so hidden and unnatural a place, and instead she lifted her wand higher so that its light traced the edges of the door and revealed the shallow carvings set into the metal bands, which Harry now saw were not merely decorative, but formed repeating patterns of the folded bird symbol, each one slightly different from the last, as though marking stages of some long-forgotten sequence. Eddie moved closer to Harry, his voice low and tight. "They sound like the ones I heard before, only then I thought they were behind me." Harry felt the weight of that, because nothing in this place had proved straightforward, and the idea that the same unseen pursuers could shift position without passing through the intervening space was exactly the sort of rule this passage might obey. "They may not be following you," he said, keeping his voice steady. "They may be following the path." Behind them, through the sealed wall, Hermione's voice came again, strained now with distance but still sharp with urgency. "We have found another entrance to the hall. It is different from the first, and the markings here are not the same. Stay where you are if you can." Ron's voice followed, faint and echoing. "And if you cannot, try not to vanish entirely. It would be inconvenient." Harry almost smiled at that, though the tension in the room pressed down like a physical weight, because Ron's way of speaking in the face of danger had always been to treat it as something that might yet be argued with, as though a sufficiently sarcastic remark could persuade it to behave more reasonably. The footsteps beyond the door grew louder. Ginny turned her head slightly toward Harry. "We cannot stay here if whatever is coming knows this room." "No," Harry agreed, though he did not yet reach for the handle. "But we also cannot rush blindly into another trap." Hermione's earlier words echoed in his mind with renewed force, for this place did not simply punish carelessness, but seemed to test the reason behind every choice. The first crossing had demanded truth of purpose. The hidden door had opened only to confession of deception. Whatever lay beyond this black barrier would follow the same pattern, though the shape of its test might be very different. Luna's voice, distant but clear despite the stone between them, drifted through with an odd calm that did not quite belong to urgency. "The footsteps are not enemies in the ordinary sense. They are echoes that have learned to walk." Ron made a faint choking noise that might have been laughter. "That is worse than enemies, Luna." Harry stepped closer to the door and placed his hand upon the cold metal surface, and at once he felt a faint vibration beneath his palm. Not the steady hum of enchantment, but a rhythm that matched the approaching steps beyond, as though the door itself were listening and answering in some subtle way, maintaining a connection between what stood on either side of it. "Eddie," he said quietly, "when you tried this door before, what did you do?" "I pushed it," Eddie answered. "Then I tried to pull it. Then I used Alohomora, and nothing happened. The carvings grew warmer, but the door did not move." Hermione's voice came quickly through the wall, seizing upon that detail at once. "Warmer suggests activation rather than resistance. The door may require a specific interaction tied to those symbols. Describe them." Harry leaned closer, letting the wand light sweep across the metal bands again, and spoke slowly so that Hermione could follow. "There are rows of the bird symbol, but each one is slightly different. Some have wings closed, some are half open, some are spread wide. Between them there are lines, almost like paths or tracks." There was a pause, and Harry could almost hear Hermione thinking. Then she said, "It may represent stages of movement or transformation, a sequence that must be followed rather than forced. If the earlier parts of this passage demanded truth and completion, then this may demand understanding of order." Ginny frowned. "You mean we have to choose the right symbol?" "Not choose," Hermione corrected. "Follow." The footsteps were very near now, so near that Harry could hear the faint scrape of fabric or something like it brushing the stone beyond, and beneath that there was another sound, softer and more unsettling, like whispering voices layered together in tones too low to separate. Eddie drew closer still. "They are almost here." Harry's eyes moved across the carved birds again, and then, with a sudden clarity that felt less like thought and more like recognition, he saw it. The sequence was not random, but flowed from tightly folded wings at one end of the band to fully extended flight at the other, as though marking the stages of a bird's awakening, its gathering of strength, and its eventual release into motion. "It is a progression," he said, "from stillness to flight." Hermione answered at once. "Then begin at the start, and move through it in order. Perhaps the door will respond to that motion." Ron's voice followed, sharper now with tension. "Harry, I hate to interrupt a lovely theory, but whatever is on the other side sounds as if it would very much like to meet you." Harry did not wait any longer. He placed his fingers upon the first symbol, the one with wings fully folded, and pressed lightly. Nothing happened. Then he moved to the next, where the wings had opened just a fraction. The metal grew warm beneath his touch. "Keep going," Hermione urged. Harry traced the sequence, one symbol after another, each one heating slightly under his hand, until he reached the final carving where the bird's wings were spread wide, as though in full flight, and as his fingers closed over it, the warmth flared into sudden heat. At once the footsteps beyond the door stopped. The silence that followed was far worse than the sound had been. Then, from the other side, a voice spoke. It was not one voice, but many layered together, speaking in perfect unison with a tone that held neither anger nor welcome, but something far colder: recognition. "Sequence acknowledged." The door shuddered. The metal bands shifted, sliding against one another with a low grinding sound, and the carvings of the birds seemed to ripple as though they were no longer fixed in place but part of something living beneath the surface. Harry stepped back, raising his wand, while Ginny moved to his side and Eddie retreated a pace behind them, his breath quick and uneven. The black door began to open. Not inward, but sideways, splitting along a vertical seam that had been invisible a moment before, and as the halves drew apart, they revealed a corridor beyond, unlike any passage Harry had yet seen beneath Hogwarts, for its walls were lined with tall standing shapes that might at first have been taken for statues, except that they were too still, too narrow, and too perfectly aligned. Then one of them moved. It did not step forward, but inclined its head with a slow, deliberate motion, and the dim light revealed a face that was not truly a face at all, but a smooth surface upon which faint features seemed to form and dissolve like reflections in water. More of them shifted. A dozen, perhaps more, standing in two silent rows along the corridor, each one identical in height and shape, each one turning as the door opened, their attention fixing upon Harry with that same unsettling unity. And from all of them at once came the whisper, soft as breath and cold as stone. "Harry James Potter has entered the remembered path." For one long and dreadful moment, no one within that narrow stone room moved at all, because the sight beyond the opened black door was of such an uncanny kind that the mind resisted it before it understood it, and the rows of pale standing figures in the corridor beyond, with their smooth shifting features and their strange shared attention, seemed less like living beings than like thoughts given shape by old magic and set to wait in silence until the proper name was spoken. Harry kept his wand raised, though he did not cast at once, for everything they had learned in the hidden passages beneath Hogwarts warned against striking blindly at magic that obeyed laws older and subtler than brute force, and there was in those motionless ranks no immediate sign of attack, only a listening stillness so complete that even the faint scrape of Eddie's shoe behind him sounded startlingly loud. Ginny stood at Harry's shoulder, every line of her body taut and ready, while the light from her wand moved across the nearest of the figures and showed that its surface was not flesh, nor stone, nor metal, but something like polished plaster shot through with pearly threads, as though it had been shaped from cooled moonlight and ash together. Where eyes ought to have been, there were hollows of changing silver, and within those hollows expressions flickered and vanished too quickly to hold. Now stern, now sorrowful, now blank as water under cloud. Eddie swallowed audibly. They were not there before. That does not mean they were absent, said Luna's voice, faint through the wall behind them. And if the words were unsettling, it was only because they sounded perfectly reasonable in her mouth. Some things in old places do not appear until the story reaches the right page. Ron, somewhere farther off with Hermione and Neville, gave a muffled protest that might have been directed at the passage, Luna, or fate in general. Nothing about that sentence is helpful. Hermione's voice followed quickly, urgent but controlled. Harry, do not engage unless they move first. Ask a question. Ancient guardians often respond to form and intent before they respond to force. Harry had already thought the same, though the fact that Hermione said it aloud steadied him. The corridor beyond the door did not feel like an ambush laid by some hidden enemy. It felt like a threshold, and thresholds were dangerous in their own way because one might cross them without understanding what had been demanded in the crossing. The nearest figure inclined its head again, and the whisper came once more from all the ranks at once, no louder than before, yet filling the corridor with a pressure like held breath. Harry James Potter has entered the remembered path. Harry took one careful step forward, stopping just short of the doorway, and answered in as even a voice as he could manage. We came to rescue Eddie Kirk and leave this place. The silver hollows of the nearest figures rippled. For an instant, their shifting faces all became the same face. Dumbledore's, not precisely as Harry had known him in life, but recognizable enough to strike him like a blow, for the long nose, the half-moon gaze, and the grave composure were all there, though thinned and flattened into something colder, more symbolic, like the memory of a person shaped by magic that understood role better than heart. Eddie gave a tiny gasp. Ginny's grip tightened on her wand. Then the face changed again. McGonagall. Then Flitwick. Then Snape. Then strangers in robes of fashion centuries out of date, and witches with circlets of tarnished silver in their hair, and wizards whose collars were worked with birds and stars. Until Harry understood with a cold certainty that these figures were not choosing faces to deceive them, as the earlier passage had done, but drawing upon the line of those who had governed, taught, or guarded Hogwarts across ages too long to count. Hermione heard it in his silence before he said it aloud. They are not illusions, she called through the wall, or not merely illusions. They may be mnemonic constructs, repositories of record bound to the place itself. Ron's voice floated after hers, sour with unease. You make that sound academic, Hermione. It still sounds horrible. The nearest figure spoke again, though this time the chorus had narrowed into a single clear voice that still seemed to come from many mouths at once. State the breach. Harry felt the air in the room sharpen. This, then, was another rule. Another gate. He glanced once at Eddie, whose pale face and frightened eyes were answer enough to him, and then looked back at the silver ranks. A younger student was lured here by false appearance, Harry said. We followed to bring him back. A rustle moved through the corridor, though none of the figures took a step. Instead, their surfaces shivered as if some current had passed through them. The faces changed again, now to expressions of stern attention that did not belong to any single person Harry could name. False appearance acknowledged, said the chorus. Rescue intent acknowledged. Lineage variance detected. Harry frowned. What does that mean? No answer came at once. Instead, the figures along the left wall lifted their hands in perfect unison and pointed farther down the corridor, where the dimness had hidden the space beyond them until now. As Harry's wand light reached deeper, he saw that the passage did not extend very far, but opened into a circular chamber at the end. And in the center of that chamber stood a pedestal of black stone, upon which rested a small object that caught the light with a dull red gleam. Harry felt a jolt of recognition before reason supplied its form. A bird-shaped brooch. Its wings were folded tight against its body, and at the center where the heart might have been set, a dark red stone that glowed not brightly but steadily, like an ember buried deep in ash. Eddie made a sound somewhere between fear and relief. "That is what I saw before I ran." Ginny's voice went hard at once. "That thing caused all this?" Hermione answered before anyone else could, her voice suddenly intent. "Perhaps not caused, but activated. A keyed relic could wake a whole network of protective enchantments if moved, touched, or even approached by the wrong person." "Why would it be left down here?" Ron called. "Because," said Luna softly through the wall, "it was not left, it was kept." The word rang true in the stillness. Harry looked back at the silent ranks of memory figures. "Do we need that brooch to get out?" The nearest construct tilted its head, and in its shifting face, Harry thought for one eerie instant he saw the outline of Rowena Ravenclaw from a moving tapestry in one of the castle corridors, though it dissolved before he could be certain. "Removal is forbidden," said the chorus. "Recognition is required." "Recognition of what?" Harry asked. Again the faces changed, and this time one expression held longer than the rest, not because Harry knew it, but because it bore an unmistakable resemblance to the folded bird repeated across the hidden doors and walls, as though the person and the symbol had once belonged to one another. "Keeper's mark," said the figures. Hermione drew in a sharp breath loud enough to be heard through the stone. "It is not a founder relic," she said, "or not directly. It may belong to a later custodian, someone charged with maintaining the hidden wards below the school." Ron sounded baffled. "There are hidden custodians now?" "There were hidden custodians," Hermione corrected. "Possibly centuries ago. Hogwarts has had private magical systems before. Think of the Chamber of Secrets, the Room of Requirement, the moving staircases, the old protective architecture around the headmaster's office. The school was never built in only one layer." Harry stared at the brooch. Then why would someone lure Eddie here? At that, the silver ranks all turned their heads toward him together, and for the first time, there was something like judgment in the movement, not hostile exactly, but grave enough to make the hair on his arms rise. "Because the remembered path was sought," said the chorus, "because the mark was stirred, because a hand not sworn attempted claim." Eddie stepped forward a fraction. "I did not touch it." The nearest figure's shifting face softened, though whether in sympathy or mere acknowledgement, Harry could not tell. "Not the child," it said. "Another." That struck them all. Ginny spoke first. "Someone else came down here before Eddie." "Or sent him to wake the way," Harry said. Hermione's voice sharpened at once. "Yes, if the passage is keyed to truth, false appearance, sequence, and recognition, then an intruder who could not pass one of those tests might use a younger student as an unwitting trigger." Ron sounded appalled. "That is lower than anything Malfoy has ever tried, and that is saying quite a lot." Harry's mind was already moving through faces and possibilities, though without settling, because too many students could have done such a thing, and too many older magical disturbances at Hogwarts had begun with someone believing they could master what they barely understood. But before he could follow the thought farther, the brooch on the pedestal flared. Not bright red now, but gold at its edges, as though fire were beginning beneath metal. Every silver figure in the corridor went still. Then the chorus said, with sudden urgency, unlike anything heard from it before, "Claimant returns." The words rang through the corridor like the toll of a distant bell, and with them came a subtle yet unmistakable shift in the air, as though the hidden chambers beneath Hogwarts had drawn a breath and now held it in tense anticipation of what was about to unfold, while the faint golden glow spreading from the brooch upon the pedestal deepened with each passing second, casting long, wavering shadows that moved across the walls like silent wings. Harry felt at once that whatever had lured Eddie here, whatever had stirred the ancient mechanisms of this place, was no longer hidden behind trickery or distance, but was drawing steadily closer, and the memory figures lining the corridor, which had until now stood as watchers and judges, seemed to withdraw slightly, not in fear, but in deference to a presence that belonged to the same order of magic, yet carried a different intention. Ginny's voice was low but fierce. "We are not letting anyone take that brooch." "No," Harry said, though his eyes remained fixed on the far chamber, where the golden light now pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat awakening after long silence. "But we need to understand what they want from it." Eddie shifted uneasily. "If they used me to open the path, then they must not be able to get through it themselves." Hermione's voice came through the wall, quick and sharp with thought. "That suggests they failed one of the conditions we passed. Perhaps they relied on deception and could not admit it, or they lack the correct intent. Either way, they needed someone else to move the system forward." Ron's voice followed, edged with a grim sort of logic. "And now that we have done all the hard parts, they have come to finish the job. That is just brilliant." Luna spoke more softly, yet with a certainty that seemed to settle into the stones themselves. "They think the story is ready for them, but they have not told it properly." The footsteps came again. Not from behind the black door now, nor from the corridor they had crossed, but from the chamber ahead, beyond the pedestal, where no entrance had been visible before, and yet the sound approached as though a hidden passage had opened in answer to the brooch's awakening. Harry stepped forward into the corridor of silent figures, his wand steady though his pulse had quickened, and Ginny moved beside him without hesitation, while Eddie remained close behind, unwilling to be left yet plainly unwilling to advance alone. The silver constructs did not bar their way, but turned their shifting faces to follow them as they passed, their hollow eyes reflecting the growing gold light ahead. As Harry reached the threshold of the circular chamber, the footsteps ceased. Then a figure stepped into view. At first Harry thought it was a student, for the robes were those of Hogwarts, dark and familiar, and the posture held a human shape. Yet something in the stillness of that stance was wrong, not in the way of the earlier illusions that had drawn upon expectation, but in a deeper sense, as though the person standing there had aligned themselves too perfectly with the place, becoming part of its structure rather than merely moving within it. The figure lifted its head. It was Michael Corner. Eddie gave a startled cry. "Michael!" Ginny's eyes narrowed at once. "That is not him." Michael, if it was Michael, smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes, which glimmered faintly with the same gold that now burned within the brooch upon the pedestal. "You have come farther than expected," he said, and his voice was his own, yet layered faintly with another tone beneath it, as though something older spoke through him in careful imitation. "I wondered which of you would solve the path first." Harry did not lower his wand. "You used Eddie to open the way." Michael's smile did not falter. I guided him. The distinction matters in places such as this." "No," said Ginny sharply. "It does not." For a moment something flickered in Michael's expression, something colder, more rigid, as though the mask he wore had tightened. "You misunderstand the purpose of this place," he said. "It was not built to protect a trinket, nor to test idle curiosity. It was built to preserve control over something far older than the school above us." Hermione's voice cut in through the wall, urgent now. "Harry, do not let him touch the brooch. If it is a control key, then activating it improperly could bind the entire system to him." Ron added, "In simpler terms, stop him doing anything clever." Harry took another step forward, placing himself between Michael and the pedestal. "Then you will explain it before you go any further." Michael tilted his head slightly, and for an instant the golden light in his eyes flared brighter. "Explain?" he repeated. "You stand within a network of memory and warding left by those who shaped Hogwarts when its foundations were still new, and you ask for explanation as though it were a lesson in charms." "Then make it simple," Ginny said, her voice steady as steel. Michael's gaze shifted to her, and the flicker of something human returned for a heartbeat before being smoothed away again. "The brooch is a marker of authority," he said, "a key that allows its bearer to command the hidden passages, to direct the guardian, to open or close the remembered path. It was meant to be used by one who understood its rules." "And you think that is you?" Harry said. "I know it is," Michael replied, and now there was no trace of doubt in his voice, only a calm conviction that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "The castle is changing. The old protections are weakening. Someone must take hold of what remains before it is lost." Hermione's voice came again, sharper than before. "That is not how these systems work. They are not meant to be controlled by individuals, but maintained by balance. If he forces a claim, the wards could become unstable." Ron added, "Which I assume is a polite way of saying everything might explode." Luna's voice followed, softer but no less certain. "Or worse, it might obey the wrong story." Harry held Michael's gaze. "You did not come here to protect Hogwarts," he said. "You came because you wanted power over it." For the first time, Michael's expression shifted fully, the careful calm breaking into something more raw, more human, yet twisted by the golden light now burning steadily in his eyes. "Power is only a word used by those who fear responsibility," he said. "I came because no one else would act." "You nearly got Eddie killed," Ginny said, and there was nothing restrained in her voice now. Michael's gaze flickered toward Eddie, and for a fraction of a second something like regret passed across his face, though it vanished almost at once. "A necessary risk," he said quietly. "That is where you are wrong," Harry answered, and now his voice carried the same certainty that had guided him across the shifting floor. "Because every part of this place has rejected you already. The illusions, the crossing, the door. You could not pass them, so you tried to use someone else. That is not how this works." The golden light in the chamber flared brighter. The brooch pulsed once, then again. And the silver figures in the corridor behind Harry all turned at once, their shifting faces fixing upon Michael with a new and unmistakable intensity. "Claimant identified," said the chorus. "Claimant unproven." Michael took a step toward the pedestal. "I will prove it," he said. Harry raised his wand. "No," he said. But the brooch flared again, and the chamber answered. The answering of the chamber did not come as a blast of force or a sudden assault, but as a deep and resonant shifting of the very air, as though the hidden structure beneath Hogwarts had awakened fully at last and now turned all its ancient attention upon the single act unfolding at its heart, while the golden light of the brooch rose in a slow, steady flare that cast every shadow sharp and long, so that the chamber seemed no longer a room, but a stage upon which judgment would be rendered according to laws none of them had written, and none could escape. Michael moved again, not with haste, but with a controlled determination that suggested he believed the moment already his, and Harry stepped forward to meet him, wand raised, though he knew even as he did so that spells alone would not decide what happened here, because every barrier they had crossed had obeyed deeper rules than simple magic could command. "You do not understand what you are claiming," Harry said. His voice firm, despite the tension that pressed against his ribs like a tightening band. "This place does not belong to you." Michael's gaze burned with that unnatural gold, yet beneath it there flickered something strained, as though the very power he sought was pressing back against him even as he reached for it. "It belongs to no one," he said. "That is why it has fallen into neglect. That is why its guardians have become nothing more than echoes and riddles. I will give it direction again." "You will break it," Hermione's voice came sharply through the stone, for though she could not see the chamber, she understood it perhaps better than any of them. "These systems depend on balance, not control. If you force them to obey, they will resist, and if they resist, the consequences will not be contained to this place." Ron's voice followed, tense but resolute. "In other words, do not touch the glowing ancient thing that clearly doesn't want to be touched." Luna spoke more softly, yet her words carried with them a quiet certainty that seemed to settle into the chamber itself. "It is not waiting to be taken. It is waiting to be answered." The brooch pulsed again. This time the light did not merely flare, but spread outward in thin lines that traced themselves across the floor like veins of molten gold, forming a pattern that reached from the pedestal to where Harry and Michael stood. And as those lines touched the edges of their feet, both boys felt the same strange sensation, as though the ground itself had begun to listen. The silver figures in the corridor stepped forward as one. Not into the chamber, but to its threshold, where they halted and stood like silent witnesses. Their shifting faces now stilled into a single expression of grave attention. "Claimant must declare," said the chorus. Michael drew himself up, and for a moment he seemed almost himself again, a student standing in defiance of something vast and ancient, driven not by malice but by a belief so strong it had blinded him to everything else. "I claim the mark of the Keeper," he said. "I claim authority over the remembered path and the wards it governs." The golden lines flared, then dimmed. The chamber remained silent. Michael's expression tightened. "It is not enough," he said, more to himself than to the others. "There must be more." Whoa, Harry felt the truth of that even before the chamber answered, because every test they had faced had demanded not only action, but understanding, not only intent, but honesty, and what Michael had offered was neither incomplete nor false, but something else entirely. It was self-serving. "State the purpose," said the chorus. Michael hesitated. Only for a moment, but it was enough. Harry stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence with a clarity that surprised even him. "He cannot," he said, "because he is not here to serve the place. He is here to make it serve him." Michael's head snapped toward him, anger flashing at last through the gold-lit calm. "And you are better?" he demanded. "You who have broken rules, defied authority, and bent magic to your will more times than anyone here?" Harry did not flinch. "Yes," he said simply. "Because I never did it alone, and I never did it for control." The words seemed to settle into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. Ginny stepped beside him, her voice fierce and unwavering. "We came together," she said. "We crossed because we trusted each other, not because we wanted to master this place." Eddie, though his voice trembled, spoke as well. "And I was wrong to follow something I did not understand," he said. "But they came for me anyway." From beyond the wall, Hermione's voice joined them, steady and sure. "The system has already shown its rules: truth, purpose, sequence, recognition. It does not respond to ambition. It responds to responsibility." Ron added, with a surprising firmness beneath his usual tone. "And responsibility means not risking other people just to prove you are clever." Luna's voice came last, soft yet clear as starlight. "The story is not about who holds the key. It is about why the door is opened." The golden lines on the floor brightened. The brooch flared once more. And this time, when the chamber spoke, its voice was no longer divided. Purpose acknowledged. Michael staggered back as though struck, the golden light in his eyes flickering wildly, no longer steady but breaking apart like reflections on disturbed water. "No," he said, and there was real fear in his voice now. "That is not." But the chamber had already turned from him. The light shifted, flowing past him as though he were no longer part of the pattern, and gathered instead around Harry, Ginny, and Eddie, where it rose in a soft, steady glow that felt not like power, but like recognition. "Claim denied," said the voice. "Claim fulfilled." Michael cried out, reaching toward the pedestal, but the moment his hand crossed the golden lines, they flared with blinding brightness, and he was thrown back as though the air itself had struck him, landing hard against the stone wall with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. The brooch lifted from the pedestal. Not high, not dramatically, but just enough to break contact with the stone, and as it did, the folded wings upon its surface shifted, opening a fraction for the first time in centuries. Then the light faded. The chamber grew still. And the brooch settled once more, its glow now dim and quiet, like an ember that had chosen not to become flame. Harry lowered his wand slowly, his breath steadying as the tension drained from the air, and for a long moment no one spoke. Because the sense of something vast and ancient passing judgment had not yet fully lifted. Then, from the corridor behind them, the silver figures bowed their heads in unison. And the black door behind Harry swung open once more, revealing the passage back. Hermione's voice came through, filled with relief. "The way is clear." Ron added, "About time." Harry looked once at Michael, who lay stunned but conscious against the wall, the gold gone from his eyes, leaving only shock and the beginnings of regret, and then turned back to the others. "Let us go," he said quietly. And this time, the passage did not resist. The return through the hidden passages beneath Hogwarts was not swift, though the way no longer shifted against them with the same sly resistance as before. And there was in that change something almost solemn, as though the ancient wards, having weighed the matter and given judgment, had withdrawn their hostility, and now allowed the little company to pass as guests rather than intruders, while the silver mist in the round chamber lay quiet as polished glass, and the shining crossing in the great hall had become once more a pale and motionless veil, beneath which the shadowed guardian drifted in slow, deep silence, no longer rising to threaten, but watching with the distant patience of something bound to endure long after those who crossed above it had grown old. When Harry, Ginny, and Eddie came through the reopened black door and rejoined Hermione, Ron, Neville, and Luna on the far side of the wall, the relief in the chamber was so sharp that it nearly undid them all at once. For Ron caught Harry by both shoulders and looked as though he meant to shake him soundly before deciding against it, while Hermione's face had gone pale with strain and anger together, the sort of anger that only appeared when fright had cut too close to the bone, and Neville let out so great a breath that he seemed to have been holding it since the moment the hidden door first appeared beneath the tapestry. "You are impossible," Hermione said, though the force of the words was weakened by the unmistakable tremor of relief behind them. "Completely, utterly impossible, and if you had fallen through that crossing properly, I would never have forgiven you." Harry, bruised and aching and colder than he liked to admit, managed a faint smile. "I shall do my best not to make a habit of it." Ron snorted, though there was emotion enough in the sound to roughen it. That would be a refreshing change. Ginny, who had not said a word since they left the circular chamber, turned at last and fixed Eddie with a look so stern that the younger boy shrank slightly, despite having faced hidden magic, false corridors, and an ancient guardian without quite fainting. "And you," she said, "are never again following mysterious notes from people you barely know into secret parts of the castle, even if they promise you rooms no one else has ever seen, jewels from the Founders, or the Chudley Cannon's reserve team tryouts." Eddie flushed scarlet, which at least proved he was fully himself. "I know," he muttered. "I know it was stupid." Whoa, Luna, who had bent over the silver basin and was now watching faint ripples pass across its quiet surface, looked up and said in her mild, dreamy voice, "It was unwise, certainly, though perhaps not entirely stupid, because some places are very good at making people feel specially chosen, and that can be difficult to resist when one has spent a long time being unnoticed." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Eddie stared at her as though she had somehow opened a window into his thoughts and peered in without the least embarrassment. Harry saw Hermione's expression soften a little, and even Ginny, though still severe, looked less angry than she had a moment before. "That," said Ron after a pause, "is annoyingly fair." They made their way back up the curving stair toward the hidden door in the second-floor corridor, taking Michael with them, because though he had recovered consciousness before they left the Chamber of the Brooch, he had said very little after the ancient ward denied him, and what little he had said came in short, stiff answers that carried more shame than defiance. He did not struggle, nor attempt escape, and Harry suspected that the experience beneath Hogwarts had stripped away whatever bright certainty had first driven him downward, leaving only the uncomfortable weight of what he had nearly done. By the time they reached the top of the staircase, the silver outline of the secret door had already begun to fade from the stones, as though the passage were folding itself shut behind them. Not forever, perhaps, but for a season or a year or until some future need woke it again. Harry laid a hand for a moment on the cold wall where the handle shaped like the sleeping bird had first appeared, and though the surface was now blank, he fancied he could still feel some buried echo of the old magic there, listening, remembering, and settling once more into its long-hidden watch. They had scarcely emerged from behind the tapestry when quick footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor, and Professor McGonagall came striding toward them with Professor Flitwick and Tonks close behind, their faces sharp with alarm that turned at once to a very different sort of gravity when they saw not only Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, and Luna after curfew in a forbidden part of the school, but Eddie dusty and shaken, and Michael silent among them. What followed was, in its way, nearly as formidable as the chambers below. Harry had long experience of Professor McGonagall's anger. And he knew by now that it was at its most dangerous when kept under tight control, and so he was not surprised when she said, in a voice almost unnaturally calm, "You will all come with me," in the tone of one who had decided to postpone astonishment until she had every fact in order and the offending parties where they could not immediately vanish into fresh catastrophe. They were taken first not to Gryffindor Tower or Ravenclaw, nor even to the hospital wing, though Madame Pomfrey was summoned presently to examine Eddie and Harry, but to the headmistress's office, where the fire burned low beneath the portraits of former heads and headmistresses, some of whom woke and began whispering among themselves the instant the students entered, because portraits at Hogwarts had never yet learned the dignity of silence when scandal was near. There, under McGonagall's stern eye and Flitwick's watchful concern, the whole story came out at last. Not in a tumble as such stories often did, but piece by piece, carefully laid down, with Hermione clarifying what she had observed, Luna adding the odd but crucial perceptions that no one else had thought to notice, Ginny speaking plainly where anger required plainness, and Eddie, to his credit, confessing his own part in the affair without trying to soften it. Michael at first remained quiet, but when McGonagall turned those piercing eyes upon him and asked, not unkindly but with terrible directness, whether he wished the others to speak all or whether he had anything truthful to add, he bowed his head and admitted that he had discovered references in an old marginal note in the library, had become convinced that a hidden warding system lay neglected beneath the school, and had persuaded himself that if he could awaken and claim it, he might protect Hogwarts better than those who currently oversaw it. At that, one of the portraits coughed loudly and muttered, "Classic mistake," while another shushed him at once. McGonagall listened without interruption, though Harry saw the deepening disappointment in her face, and when Michael had finished, she said only, "Good intentions are not made noble by secrecy, arrogance, or the endangerment of others, Mr. Corner, and you have displayed all three." No one could have wished to be in Michael's place then, and Harry felt, beneath the anger the boy had earned, a reluctant pity too, because it was plain by now that Michael had not set out to do evil, only to become important in the most foolish and dangerous way available to him, and Hogwarts had never lacked for students who mistook hidden knowledge for rightful claim. The matter did not end that night, of course, for matters at Hogwarts seldom did, but its heart was settled there. Michael would face discipline, the details of which McGonagall did not announce before the others, though the look on his face suggested he did not expect lenience. Eddie was sent to the hospital wing, and then to bed under instructions to report at once if he so much as sneezed silver mist before breakfast. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, and Luna lost points, received stern warnings, and were each told, with varying emphasis, that though their conduct had been reckless, their loyalty to a fellow student was not in question. That last mattered. It mattered more than the lost sleep, the bruises, or the points. For when at last they were dismissed and stepped out into the pale first hint of dawn gathering over the castle windows, the night's danger seemed to fall away enough for its truest shape to be seen. And that shape was not the guardian beneath the crossing, nor the silver figures, nor the glowing brooch in its hidden chamber, but a much simpler thing. One student had been drawn into peril, and the others had gone after him. They had argued, guessed wrong, blundered, risked too much, and frightened one another half out of their wits, but they had not turned aside. As they walked back through the waking corridors of Hogwarts, where the portraits were stirring, and the first house elves would soon be lighting fires, Harry glanced at those beside him and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with dawn. Ron looked exhausted and cross, Hermione overthinking 3 things at once, Ginny quietly furious on principle, Neville proud in the shy, astonished way he had when courage caught up with him after the fact, Luna serene as moonlight, and Eddie still dazed to find himself safely among them at all. The castle above seemed ordinary again, yet Harry knew better now than before that beneath its familiar towers and corridors lay older rooms, older tests, and older stories waiting in the dark, and perhaps that knowledge should have troubled him. Instead, as the first gold of morning touched the high windows, it only made Hogwarts feel more truly itself, a place of danger and secrecy, certainly, but also of rescue, of return, and of friendship strong enough to go down into the hidden dark and bring someone home. By breakfast, the rumors had already begun, as they always did. Though no version yet whispered at the Gryffindor table came close to the truth, and Harry thought with private satisfaction that the truth belonged not to gossip, but to those who had lived it. Eddie, pale but smiling weakly over his porridge, was alive to hear the rumors and blush at them. Michael, though absent, had at least been stopped before his ambition broke something the school had guarded for centuries. And the hidden path beneath Hogwarts, if it still remembered the night at all, had remembered rightly. It had not been power that carried the story through. It had been friends. And in Hogwarts, as Harry had learned again and again, that was often the strongest magic of all.
Ну що ж, друзі, трошки мого авторського аналізу про те, що я хотів вам донести. Дивіться, тут має зачепити не сам таємничий прохід і навіть не небезпека, яка чекала під Гогвартсом, а має зачепити момент, коли Едді повірив знайомому обличчю і пішов слідом, не поставивши собі жодного зайвого запитання. Тепер часто запитаємо себе, скільки разів у житті ми теж йдемо на чимось лише тому, що воно виглядає знайомим. Скільки разів довіряємо словам, обіцянкам чи людям не тому, що вони заслужили нашу довіру, а тому, що нам хочеться в них повірити. І чи вистачає нам сміливості, як Едді наприкінці визнати, так, мене вели в оману. Бо саме цей момент виявився ключем до виходу. Мені здається, історія нагадує дуже просту річ. Помилитися не соромно. Набагато небезпечніше триматися за красиву неправду лише тому, що колись ми її обрали. Іноді перший крок до порятунку – не знайти правильні двері, а чесно визнати, що зайшов не туди. Мабуть, справжня мудрість починається саме там, де закінчується виправдання. І саме ця чесність часто проводить нас із найтемніших лабіринтів. Дякую всім за увагу. Надіюся, моя історія допоможе вам правильно думати і вибиратися з цих же самих найтемніших лабіринтів. Всім дякую за увагу. До нових зустрічей.